The word hit Violet Shepard like a fist to the sternum. She decides. Roy Norris stood in the center of the bunkhouse doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, the late afternoon sun cutting hard shadows across his jaw. His hat was in his hand, turning slowly between his calloused fingers, and he was staring at the packed dirt floor as if the words he'd just heard from Hector Crane, owner of the Double C Ranch, were written there in some language he was still trying to translate. Violet had come to the bunkhouse to retrieve the ledger she'd left behind that morning, and she had frozen 2 steps inside the door when she heard Hector's voice carrying from just beyond the far wall. She hadn't meant to listen. She'd meant to grab the book and leave. But then she'd heard her name and her feet had turned to stone. Hector Crane had said, in that flat, gravel-packed voice of his, "She decides what happens on that side of the ranch, Roy. You want to argue with that, you can argue with my boot finding the back of your trousers on the way to the gate." And Roy Norris, her foreman, the man who had barely spoken 20 words directly to her in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived, had gone quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than any argument. Violet pressed her back against the rough-hewn timber wall inside the bunkhouse. Her heart was slamming so hard she was certain both men could hear it through the wood. She clutched the ledger against her chest like a shield. She decides. 3 words. 3 words from a man who had looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't asked for, handed down by a court in Laramie, Wyoming in the autumn of 1882. She hadn't asked to be here either. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked to be the last surviving member of a homesteading family with a legal claim to the eastern acreage of the Double C. A claim that Hector Crane's own lawyer had confirmed was valid and binding. A claim that had forced the old rancher's hand in a way that clearly set his teeth on edge. She hadn't asked to be 24 years old and utterly alone in a territory that still settled disputes with bullets more often than with courtrooms. And she absolutely had not asked to feel the way she felt every single time Roy Norris walked into a room. That was the most terrifying secret of all. Outside, she heard Roy's boots shift in the dirt. She heard him exhale, long and controlled, the way a man exhales when he is choosing not to say the first 10 things that come to mind. "Understood," he said, just that, 1 word. And then the sound of his boots walking away, slow and deliberate, toward the stable. Violet leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She pressed the ledger harder against her ribs, as if she could slow her heartbeat by force. She decides what happens on that side of the ranch. The question was whether she could survive being in charge of anything at all when the man she was supposed to be managing had already quietly dismantled every wall she tried to build. She needed to go back to the beginning, to understand how she had arrived at this impossible, terrifying, wonderful, disastrous moment. 6 weeks earlier, in early October of 1882, Violet Shepard had stepped off a stagecoach in the town of Broken Spur, Wyoming, carrying a carpet bag, a rifle she'd inherited from her father, and a legal document that the driver of the stage had offered to use as kindling on 2 separate occasions during the journey. Broken Spur was the kind of town that looked like it had been built on a dare. It had a main street of baked red dirt flanked by buildings that leaned into each other like tired men, a general store, a feed and grain, a telegraph office that also served as the post office, a saloon called the Dusty Nail, and a land office that was currently serving double duty as the unofficial headquarters of every territorial dispute in a 50-mile radius. Violet had not expected beauty. She had grown up on a homestead 40 miles east of Cheyenne, and she understood what the frontier looked like when it wasn't performing for anyone. But Broken Spur had a desolate quality that went deeper than aesthetics. It felt like a town that was waiting for something bad to happen, and she was not at all certain she wasn't the something bad. Her father, Thomas Shepard, had died of a fever the previous winter. Her mother, Clara, had been gone 4 years before that, taken by the same diphtheria outbreak that had swept through half the territory in 1878. Violet had managed the homestead alone for almost a year before the lawyer in Laramie, a slight, careful man named Mr. Aldous Finch, had contacted her about the eastern acreage situation. It turned out that Thomas Shepard had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres in Crook County, Wyoming, a claim that legally abutted the existing range of the Double C Ranch, and that had been quietly ignored by Hector Crane for the better part of a decade, on the assumption that old Thomas would either abandon it or die of something convenient before anyone official noticed. Thomas had done the second, but not in the right order. He'd filed the completed claim with full improvement documentation 9 months before his death, and the law was the law, even in Wyoming. Violet had two choices. She could sell the acreage to Crane for whatever he chose to offer, or she could go and work it. Finch had been honest with her. Crane's initial offer was insultingly low, barely enough to cover the stagecoach fare back east, let alone rebuild her life. And Violet, who had inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's iron nerve, had chosen to go and work it. What she had not anticipated was that the eastern acreage was entirely surrounded on 3 sides by Double C land, with access only through the ranch's property, and that a woman showing up alone to claim it was going to cause the kind of friction that had a tendency in 1882 Wyoming to start fires. Hector Crane had met her at the gate. He was a large man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a face like weathered sandstone and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale and flat and giving nothing away. He had not been rude to her, but he had not been welcoming either, and his first words to her had been, "I hope you've thought this through, Miss Shepard, because it's a long way back to civilization once winter sets in." She had said, with a steadiness she had been proud of, "I have thought it through, Mr. Crane." "Where can I put my bag?" He had studied her for a moment, and something had shifted in those pale eyes. Not warmth exactly, more like a recalculation. He had turned then and called for Roy. Roy Norris had come out of the stable leading a bay mare, and Violet's first impression of him had been that he was the kind of man who looked like the land had made him. He was tall, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair that was longer than fashion dictated, and a jaw that carried 3 days of black beard. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste effort on things that didn't matter. His eyes were brown, the deep, warm brown of creek water over red rock, and when Hector introduced him, those eyes had swept over Violet with an expression that she could not immediately interpret. It hadn't been dismissal, it hadn't been the frank appraisal she'd braced for. It had been something more careful than either, something that looked almost like concern, and for reasons she couldn't explain that had frightened her more than contempt would have. "Roy, this is Miss Shepard. She'll be working the eastern section. Make sure she knows the property lines and has what she needs to settle in." Roy had nodded. He had looked at Violet and said, "There's a cabin on the far end of the east section. It's been empty 3 seasons, but the roof is sound. I'll take you out tomorrow." "I'd rather see it today," she said. A pause, then, "All right." That had been the beginning. The cabin was exactly as described, small, square, solid, with a stone hearth and 2 rooms, and a loft that let in thin slivers of blue sky through gaps in the roof boards that were, as promised, otherwise sound. There was a well 30 yards behind it that brought up clear, cold water, and a small lean-to stable attached to the south wall that was just large enough for 1 horse, and whatever ambitions Violet could fit around it. Roy had shown her the property lines with the precise, impersonal efficiency of a man doing a job. He'd marked the corner posts, named the creek that ran along the northern boundary, told her what months it ran high and which ones it ran low or dry. He'd checked the hearth flue and declared it clear, tested the well rope, and noted that the wood pile behind the lean-to was 2 seasons old and would need replacing before serious cold arrived. He had done all of this without looking at her more than was strictly necessary, and he had said nothing that wasn't directly related to the task, and Violet had told herself that was perfectly fine. She didn't need warmth from the foreman of a rancher who resented her existence. She needed information, and he was providing it, and that was the whole of the transaction. She had thanked him when he was done, and he had put his hat on and gotten on his horse, and the last thing he'd said to her that first day was, "Don't let the creek fool you in October. It can freeze over top while it's still running fast underneath. The ice won't hold." It was a practical warning. It was also, she realized later, the first time he had looked directly at her for more than a second, and the look in his eyes had been that same strange thing that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite anything else she had a name for. She had said, "I'll remember that." He had nodded once and ridden away. The first 2 weeks on the eastern section were the hardest 2 weeks of Violet's life, and she had lived through her mother's death and her father's long, grinding decline, so she did not use that phrase lightly. The cabin needed work beyond the cosmetic. She discovered that the floor on the east side of the main room had 2 boards that had gone soft from a slow leak in the past, and replacing them required a trip to Broken Spur for lumber that cost more than she'd wanted to spend. The well rope snapped on the 4th day and dropped the bucket, and she spent the better part of a morning fishing it out with a length of wire she bent into a hook. The Linta had a family of mice in the hay corner that took 3 nights of patient, unglamorous effort to relocate. She did all of this alone, because she was determined to do it alone, because asking for help from the Double C felt like giving Hector Crane a handhold on her independence, and independence was the only currency she had. She almost asked for help exactly once, on the 9th day, when the south wall of the Linta developed a lean that wasn't architectural so much as catastrophic, and she was standing in the cold morning looking at it with her hands on her hips and 2 options that were both bad. Roy Norris appeared at the edge of her property line on horseback, doing what she had come to recognize as his daily circuit of the eastern fence. He did it every morning, early, checking posts, and wire in the methodical way he did everything. He'd done it every single day since she arrived. She had told herself it was because he was the foreman and it was his job, and she had mostly believed that. He saw her standing at the lean-to and he stopped his horse, and he looked at the south wall and then he looked at her, and she waited for him to say something, to offer, to ask, to give her an opening she could refuse. He didn't. He just looked at the wall and then at her, and then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 heavy-gauge fence stakes and a length of good wire, and he held them out. Not a word. Just the offer, material and silent. She had walked over and taken them from his hand, and their fingers had not touched, and she had said, "Thank you," and he had said, "The east post by the creek needs attention too when you have a chance," and ridden on. That was how it went between them for 2 weeks. Efficient. Minimal. The kind of courtesy that exists in the space between professional obligation and something else that neither of them was acknowledging. And then there was the night of the storm. It came down from the north on a Tuesday evening, the 14th of October, a blue norther that turned the sky the color of an old bruise in the hour before dusk. Violet had seen that color before, and she knew what it meant. She'd moved her horse into the lean-to, brought in extra wood, filled the water barrel inside the cabin, and shuttered the windows before the first gust hit. The storm was worse than she'd anticipated. Not dangerous, exactly, but loud and insistent. The kind of wind that found every gap in a structure and made itself known through all of them simultaneously. She kept the fire high and worked on the accounts by lamplight, tracking the costs of the repairs she'd made and what she'd need for the coming weeks, building a picture of what it would take to make the eastern section genuinely productive. Around 9 in the evening, something hit the front door. Not the wind. A knock. She took her rifle from the wall, which was simple habit and not accusation, and she opened the door with it in her hands. Roy Norris was standing on her step in the full force of the storm, his coat soaked through, his hat pushed so far back by the wind that only the chin cord was keeping it on. He had a lantern in one hand and a canvas-wrapped parcel in the other, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who had not planned perfectly for a situation. "Fence is down along the north section," he said, as if announcing it from a great distance. "Two of Crane's breeding mares got through, came onto your property. I didn't want to come onto your land without telling you." She stared at him. He was soaking wet, and he had ridden through a hard north wind to knock on her door rather than just cross her property line to retrieve two horses. "Come in," she said. He hesitated. "Roy," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt the small shift it made in the air between them. "You are standing in a storm. Come in." He came in. He stood just inside the door on the portion of the floor she hadn't yet replaced, and he dripped steadily and didn't apologize for it, which she appreciated because she hadn't offered him the chance. She put the rifle back on the wall. "Where are the mares?" she asked. "Stable. My horse is with them, which he's not pleased about." There was something in that last part, the smallest edge of dry humor, that caught her off guard. "The parcel," she said, nodding at the canvas in his hand. "Cornbread and a jar of preserves. Mrs. Aldrich at the cookhouse made extra this morning." He set it on the table without ceremony. "She asked me to bring it by. It wasn't—" He stopped. "It wasn't what?" "It wasn't an order. I didn't bring it because Crane told me to." He met her eyes for a sustained moment, the first real one since they'd met. "I brought it because I wanted to. Mrs. Aldrich made it because she wanted to. That's all." Violet looked at the parcel, and at the man, and she felt something she had carefully been not feeling for 14 days begin to move under the surface of her composure like the creek moving fast beneath October ice. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. He did not offer to help, which was correct, because this was her cabin and her kitchen, and he seemed to understand that instinctively. That offering would have been a kind of intrusion. He sat at her table in his wet coat and he watched the fire, and she made coffee at the small iron stove, and the storm threw itself against the shuttered windows, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than it had been before. Not empty. Full. When she handed him the cup, his fingers did brush hers, and neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them moved away quickly. "How long have you been foreman at the Double C?" she asked. 7 years. "Do you like it?" A pause. "I like the work." "That's not the same thing." He looked at her. In the lamplight his eyes were darker and warmer and more present than she'd seen them be. "No," he said quietly, "it's not." She sat across the table and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri, came west at 18. He looked back at the fire. "You?" "I was born here, east of Cheyenne. My parents homesteaded before I could walk." "Then you know more about this land than I do." "Different country," she said. "Crook County is harder. Everything worth doing is harder than it looks from the outside." She considered that. "Is that a warning?" "No." He met her eyes again, and there was something behind his that was careful and deliberate and entirely sincere. "It's respect." She didn't know what to do with that, so she drank her coffee and let the storm fill the space where a response would have gone. He stayed 2 hours, waiting for the worst of the wind to pass. They talked in the way that people talk when they are being careful with each other, but are also, despite all caution, becoming curious. He told her about Missouri, about growing up on his father's farm, about leaving at 18 because the farm would go to the oldest brother, and there was nothing for a third son but to find his own way. She told him about her father, about the winter she'd spent alone on the homestead, about the morning the lawyer's letter arrived and she'd read it 3 times at the kitchen table before she understood what it meant and what she was going to do about it. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I hesitated for about 4 minutes," she said. "Then I started packing." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It transformed him briefly from the composed, guarded foreman into someone younger and warmer, and considerably more dangerous to her equilibrium. 4 minutes is a short hesitation for a decision this size, he said. "My mother used to say that hesitation is just fear with better manners," Violet said. She was usually right. He nodded slowly, as if storing that away. Then he stood and said the wind had dropped and thanked her for the coffee, and went out into the night to retrieve his horse and the 2 mares and bring them back through the gap in the fence she hadn't yet seen. and she stood at the door and watched his lantern move across the dark field until the darkness absorbed it. She went back inside and stood at her table for a long time, with the empty coffee cups and the canvas parcel and the sound of the dying storm overhead, and she thought, with great clarity and considerable alarm, that she was in serious trouble. The next morning, he repaired the fence. She was watching from the cabin window when he came through at first light with tools and wire, and she went out and worked beside him without being asked, holding the post while he hammered, stretching the wire while he attached it, and they did not talk much. But the silence was different now, comfortable in a way that the earlier silence had been trying to become. When they were done, he picked up his tools and said, "I'll tell Crane the north fence needs full inspection before the first real snow." "I'll do the inspection on my side," she said. He looked at her. "I know. I'm not asking for help, Roy. I know that too." He slung the tool bag over his shoulder. "I'm offering it anyway. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment in the thin morning light. "All right," she said. He nodded and walked back toward the Double C property line, and she stood at the repaired fence and watched him go. And the feeling she'd been suppressing since the night before was significantly harder to suppress in the clear light of morning. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern developed that was organic and unspoken, and she suspected, something that both of them were pretending was purely practical. Roy came along the east fence every morning. Sometimes he stopped, sometimes he didn't. When he stopped, they worked on whatever the day's task was, because there was always a task, always something the eastern section needed that was easier with 2 sets of hands. They talked while they worked about the land, about the approaching winter, about cattle and fences and the particular stubbornness of Wyoming soil, and gradually, carefully, about other things. She learned that he had a dry, subtle humor that he deployed rarely and with precision, so that when it appeared it was genuinely surprising. She learned that he read, which was not what she expected, and that he had strong opinions about water rights and grazing rotation that were considerably more sophisticated than his foreman's role required. She learned that he was watchful in a way that was not suspicious but attentive, noticing things, small things, the way the creek ran higher on the north side, the way the east wind behaved differently on her section than on the main ranch, and bringing those observations to her not as instructions, but as information, as if her understanding of her own land was something he actively wanted to contribute to. She learned that, when she said something sharp or funny, there was a particular quality to the pause before he responded, just long enough for her to wonder if she'd misjudged the moment, and then the response would come, dry and precise and perfect, and she would feel the warmth of it spread from her chest outward like the first coffee of a cold morning. She also learned that he was careful with her. Deliberately, consciously careful, in a way that was not distance but its opposite, a kind of carefulness that existed because something mattered, not because it didn't. She did not ask him why. She was fairly certain she knew, and the knowledge was something she carried with her through every day like a stone in the pocket of her coat, heavy and warm and present. The trouble arrived in the middle of November in the form of a man named Cleet Bascom. Bascom was one of Crane's hired hands, a large, weathered man in his early 40s who had been at the Double C for 4 years, and who had, from the day Violet arrived, looked at her and her land the way certain men look at things they've decided belong to them, by some natural order that exists independent of law or other people's wishes. He had never been openly hostile. He was too careful for that. But there was something in the way he positioned himself, in the way he spoke about the eastern section when she was near enough to hear, that made her instinctively aware of him the way you become aware of a stone in your boot before you look down to see it. The trouble began on a Wednesday when Violet found her east fence cut, not broken by weather or animals. Cut, 3 posts down, wire snapped clean, in a section that was too far from any cattle path to be accidental. She spent the better part of the morning repairing it, And when she was done, she stood back and looked at the cut ends of the wire and felt a cold that had nothing to do with November. She didn't tell Roy that day. She considered whether it was her place to tell him, whether doing so was asking for protection or simply providing information that affected the whole ranch's security, and she concluded it was the latter. And that evening, she walked to the Double C's main house and asked to speak to Hector Crane. Crane listened to her without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was not warm but was thorough, and she gave him the information cleanly, without drama or accusation, describing what she'd found and what she'd repaired and why she thought it merited his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Did you see who did it?" "No." "Do you have a suspicion?" She looked at him directly. "I have an observation," she said. "Someone who knows this ranch well enough to know which section of that fence would take me the longest to repair and attract the least immediate notice from the main house made that cut." Crane's pale eyes held hers. Something moved in them that she couldn't quite name, something between calculation and a harder, older thing that might have been guilt about the situation he'd put her in by resenting her claim for so long that the resentment had filtered down into his crew. "I'll handle it," he said. She nodded. She turned to go. "Miss Shepard," she stopped. "I owe you an apology for the way I received you when you first arrived. You had every legal right to that land and I treated you like an inconvenience." She turned back. He was looking at her with that same complicated expression, and she understood that this admission had cost him something, that men like Hector Crane did not offer apologies casually. "I appreciate that," she said. She paused. "I'm not an inconvenience. I'm your neighbor. I intend to be a good one." He studied her for a moment. "Roy thinks very highly of you," he said, which was completely unexpected and landed in her chest with a small, precise impact. She kept her expression composed. "Roy is a good foreman," she said. "Yes," Crane said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood. She had very deliberately not answered his actual point. She walked back to the eastern section in the dark, and she thought about what Crane had said, and she thought about Roy, and she thought about herself, and she arrived at her cabin and stood at the window with a candle and looked out at the moonlit land and tried to be honest with herself about what was happening. She was falling in love with a man she had no claim to, on land she had every claim to, in a situation that had more trap doors than a traveling magician's stage. Roy Norris was the foreman of the ranch that surrounded hers. Their positions were adjacent and complicated and loaded with the potential for misunderstanding. She had come here to be independent, to prove something to herself about her own capacity, to honor what her father had built. She had not come here to lose her heart to a brown-eyed man who brought cornbread in a storm and repaired fences in companionable silence. And yet, 2 days later, she discovered Clete Bascom on her property. He was at the southern boundary, ostensibly checking a fence that ran along the edge of the Double C's pasture, but that was, by a clear 20 feet on her side of the line. He had his horse and a pair of wire cutters, and he looked up when she rode toward him with the expression of a man who had expected to be alone and was recalculating quickly. "Bascom," she said, keeping her voice level and her hands easy on the reins. "This is my property." "Just checking the fence," he said. His tone was pleasant in the way that unpleasant things sometimes are. "Mr. Crane's orders." "Mr. Crane would have told me if he was sending anyone onto my land," she said. "That's the arrangement. Maybe he forgot." He didn't forget. She met his eyes. "Put the wire cutters away and get back on your side of the line." The pause that followed was the kind that has a thing in it, something being weighed and decided, and she kept her face calm and her posture easy, and she felt the rifle slung across her back the way you feel something you're glad you brought but sincerely hope you don't need. Bascom smiled. It did not improve his face. "Lot of land for one woman," he said. "Enough for my purposes," she said. "Move along." He moved. Slowly, with the deliberate unhurry of a man making a point, but he moved. She watched him cross back over the property line and ride toward the main ranch, and she breathed out slowly through her nose, and she thought about what she was going to do next. What she did next was go straight to Roy Norris. She found him in the stable, working on a saddle with neat, focused stitching that did not match her mental image of the work he did. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face sharpened immediately, because he read her expression with the accuracy of a man who had been paying close attention for weeks. "What happened?" he said. "Not what's wrong, not are you all right, but what happened," which was exactly the right question. She told him. All of it: the cut fence, Crane's apology, Bascom on her property that morning. She told it cleanly and without embellishment, and when she was done, Roy set down the saddle and was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to Crane," he said. "I've already talked to Crane. I'll talk to him again." He met her eyes. "Bascom being on your land with wire cutters is not a fence check. That's a provocation. Crane needs to know it's escalated." "He'll know I came to you," she said. "I don't want it to look like I can't handle my own situation." Roy looked at her for a long moment, and the warmth in his eyes was direct and unhidden in a way it hadn't been before. "Violet," he said, her first name in his voice like something placed down with care, "coming to me for information on how to handle a man who works for the ranch that borders yours is not an admission that you can't manage your own land. It's good strategy." She felt the warmth move through her chest at the sound of her name in his voice. She made herself focus. "What would you do?" she asked. "In my position." "Document everything," he said. "Dates, times, what he said, what you said." If Crane knows Bascom is a documented problem, it's harder for Crane to look the other way even if he wants to. He paused. "And I don't think he wants to. I think Crane is closer to your side of this than either of you has said out loud. You know him well. 7 years. He picked up the saddle again, turned it in his hand, set it down. "He's not a bad man, he's a stubborn one. There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at her sharply. Then the edge of that almost smile appeared. "Usually." The conversation with Crane that afternoon went differently than Violet expected, because when Roy told Crane about Bascom's presence on the eastern section, Crane's reaction was not management or dismissal, but anger, genuine and directed. The kind of anger a man feels when something he thought he'd contained has slipped its leash. He told Roy to put Bascom on 2 weeks probation, restricted to the western section, away from the property line entirely. He told him to document it. And then, with Violet still in the room, he said something that she had not anticipated at all. "Miss Shepard," he said, "I want you to have full authority over the management of the eastern section. That means your decisions about what happens on that land are final. Not advisory, final. I'll tell Roy and I'll tell the crew." She stared at him. "You don't have authority over my land to begin with, Mr. Crane." "No," he agreed, "but I have authority over the men who work next to it. And I'm making clear to every one of them that they take their direction from you when it comes to anything that touches your property line. That includes Roy." She looked at Roy, who was standing very still, his hat in his hands, turning it in that slow rotation she had come to recognize as something he did when he was working through something complicated. He did not look at her. "All right," she said. That was the conversation she had not heard in full. That was what had come before Roy's boots in the doorway of the bunkhouse, and the words, "she decides," and her heart slamming against the ledger she'd pressed to her chest. Now it was the next morning, and Violet was at the east fence doing the inspection she'd planned, and she heard Roy's horse before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of that particular bay, and she kept her hands on the fence post and her eyes on the wire and told herself to breathe normally. He stopped on the double C side of the line and dismounted, and he came and stood a foot from the fence, and she looked up. "I want to apologize," he said. She hadn't expected that. "For what?" "For the way I've been about this from the start." He held her gaze steadily, and there was nothing guarded in his face now. "When Crane first told me about your claim, I thought—" He paused. "I thought it was going to be a problem for the ranch, for him. I came out that first day ready to manage a situation, not to meet a person." She looked at him for a moment. "When did it change?" she asked. "The first day," he said. "When you said you wanted to see the cabin that afternoon instead of the next morning." The near smile again, quiet and direct. "I knew then that I was going to need to revise my assumptions." She looked back at the fence. Her hands had gone slightly unsteady on the wire, which was irritating. "Crane told me you think highly of me," she said. A pause. "He told you that." "He did." "It's true," Roy said. His voice was even, not dramatic, not careful in the way of someone managing their words, but simple and direct, the way he was when he was saying something real. "I think very highly of you, Violet. I think you are one of the most capable and determined people I have ever met, and I think you are going to make this land into something remarkable, and I have spent the better part of 2 months trying to find the right time and the right way to tell you that there is also something else." Her hands stilled on the wire. "I'm not good with this," he said, "with saying things like this. I grew up in a family that showed what it meant rather than saying it, and I've spent 7 years in a job where what you say has to be practical and useful and not get in anyone's way. But I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think you deserve to hear it said plainly." She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his hat at his side and the November sky behind him and his eyes on her face with that steady, undisguised warmth that she had been cataloging and hoarding and trying not to need. "Say it then," she said quietly. "I have feelings for you," he said. "Serious ones. The kind that don't go away when I try to put them somewhere practical." He held her gaze. "And I wanted you to know, regardless of what you do with it, because I thought you should be the one who decides." The last words hung in the air between them, echoing Crane's phrase in a way that was entirely unintentional and entirely perfect. She looked at him for a long moment. The fence wire was cold in her hands, and the sky was the white-gray of approaching winter, and somewhere on the ranch, a horse was calling to another horse, and she felt the stone she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since the storm shift and become something different, lighter and warmer and no longer a weight but a compass. "I have feelings for you too," she said. "Serious ones. The kind that make me a great deal less sensible than I like to be." Something in Roy Norris's face changed in a way she had not seen before and could not precisely describe, except that it made him look younger and more open and entirely himself in a way that took her breath, quietly and completely. He stepped to the fence and rested his forearms on the top rail, and they were 18 inches apart, and the distance felt both infinite and nothing. "I don't know exactly what this is yet," he said. "I don't know what it can be, given everything. Your land, your independence, all of it. I don't want to be something that complicates what you've built." "You've never complicated what I've built," she said. "You've been helping me build it from the second week I was here." He looked down at his hands on the rail, then back at her. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it, honestly and openly and without it being something we're managing around everything else." The formality of it, the deliberateness, was so entirely characteristic of him that she felt it like a physical warmth. "I'll allow it," she said. He nodded once, with the particular gravity he gave to things that mattered, and his hand moved across the fence rail and covered hers, and the warmth of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere in the center of her chest, where it seemed disinclined to leave. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning air with the fence between them and their hands joined on the rail, and it was, she thought, the most honest and complete thing she had felt since the last time she'd watched the sun go down at her father's homestead, and understood clearly that the world contained more beauty than sorrow, even when it was hard to remember that. Clete Bascom was fired from the Double C 2 days later. Crane told Roy first, and Roy told Violet, and Violet felt the relief of it more than she'd expected to, which told her how much of her attention had been costing her. Bascom went without scene, which surprised everyone who'd been braced for a scene, and Roy told her privately that Crane had found evidence in Bascom's belongings of correspondence with a land speculator out of Cheyenne, who had been quietly trying to acquire eastern acreage in Crook County through various means that fell somewhere between pressure and illegality. Bascom hadn't been acting on personal animosity toward Violet so much as on hired instruction, which made the whole thing colder and more alarming, and also, in an odd way, cleaner, because it was a problem with a solution rather than a prejudice with 1,000 heads. Violet wrote a letter to Aldous Finch in Laramie detailing the situation, in case the speculator proved persistent. Finch wrote back saying the man in question had already attracted attention from the Territorial Land Office and was unlikely to be a problem going forward, but that her documentation was valuable and she should keep it. Winter settled in hard over Crook County in the last week of November, and the eastern section became a daily battle with cold that required everything Violet had. She was up before dawn every morning to break ice on the water barrel and check her horse and keep the fire. She patched a gap in the cabin's north wall that she'd missed earlier and that the wind had been using to educate her about its priorities. She began building a proper wind break for the Linta from materials she'd sourced carefully through the Broken Spur General Store, a project that ate her evenings and weekends, but that she was determined to complete before the worst of December arrived. Roy came every morning. Not always with a reason, not always with a task. Sometimes he came with information, a change in the weather, something Crane needed her to know about the shared fence line, a message from Mrs. Aldrich, who had adopted Violet as something between a neighbor and a protege. Sometimes he just came and stopped, and they talked over the fence or on the frozen ground beside the cabin while the cold built itself into shapes around them. And those mornings were, she recognized with no particular surprise, the best part of her days. He took her to Broken Spur for Sunday services, formally and openly, which in a community of that size at that time was as public a declaration as anything short of a notice in the territory paper. The townspeople of Broken Spur, who had been watching Violet Shepard with a mixture of cautious respect and frank curiosity since her arrival, received this information with the polite enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for a story to produce its next development. Mrs. Aldrich, who attended the same service, squeezed Violet's hand outside the church and said nothing, which was the warmest thing anyone could have said. Hector Crane, when Roy told him of his intentions, was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "She's worth 10 of most men I've hired, Roy. Don't be a fool about this." Roy said, "I don't intend to be." Crane said, "You never intend to be a fool about anything. The intention is the easy part." Which was, Roy told Violet later, the most personal thing Hector Crane had said to him in 7 years, and they both agreed this was either deeply touching or deeply alarming, and they argued about it gently over dinner at Mrs. Aldrich's table until Mrs. Aldrich told them both they were overthinking a simple thing, which was also the most Mrs. Aldrich thing she could have said. December was cold and clear and difficult, and despite all of that, the best month of Violet's life in recent memory. The eastern section was shaping up. She had the wind break built and the south wall properly reinforced, and the cabin snug and the horse settled, and the ledger tracking a picture of the land's potential that made her father's homesteading instincts sing in her blood. She was going to need cattle come spring. She was going to need a proper well house. She was going to need help hiring a hand or two to work the section as it grew, because it would grow, she was certain of that, and she had plans for every acre. She and Roy spent Christmas at the Double C's main house, where Crane had quietly allowed Mrs. Aldrich to organize a dinner that became an event, drawing in the remaining crew and 2 neighboring ranch families, and the preacher from town and his wife, filling the big room with lantern light, and the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of people choosing warmth in the middle of a hard season. Violet sat beside Roy at the long table, and at some point during the evening his hand found hers under the table edge, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that through dessert, and then through the singing that Mrs. Aldrich started and the room picked up, and it was quiet and entirely theirs, and it felt like the first entirely unguarded thing she had done since arriving in Crook County. When the evening ended and he walked her back across the frozen ground to the eastern section, he stopped at the cabin door, and the sky above them was enormous and black and thick with stars the way Wyoming skies are in winter, and she turned to face him. He kissed her. Not with urgency, but with intention, careful and warm and completely sincere, his hand coming up to her jaw, and she felt the whole complicated structure of her defenses simply stop being relevant for a moment, like a wall that discovers it was never actually load-bearing. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, and they stood in the cold with their breath making clouds between them, and she thought she could stand here forever and not find it insufficient. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly. "Not tonight. I want to wait until the spring when the land is right and you can see what you're deciding clearly, but I want you to know I'm going to ask." She understood what he was saying. She felt it land in her chest with the full weight of what it meant. "I'll be here in the spring," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you will." January brought 3 weeks of serious cold that locked the territory down and made every task a negotiation with the elements. Violet's days became a tight, efficient loop of necessity: fire, water, horse, food, fence, repeat. And she moved through them with the focused calm of someone who has understood what is required and has committed entirely to the requirement. She was not unhappy. She was deeply alive in the way that physical challenge and emotional certainty can produce together, a kind of clarity that she understood was rare and valuable. Roy could not come every morning in the worst of the cold, because the Double C's main herd demanded everything available, but he came when he could, and twice when the temperature dropped so severely that the creek froze solid and her water barrel threatened to do the same. He arrived before dawn without announcement and helped her break ice and haul water, and he did not make it a gesture so much as a fact, practical and present, the way he approached everything that mattered. Violet thought often in those quiet pre-dawn hours about what love actually looked like when it wasn't performing itself for anyone. It looked like this, she concluded. It looked like two people who had decided to be in the same direction, doing the work of being in the same direction, without drama and without the need for constant declaration. It looked like a man who showed up before the sun because the alternative was not showing up, and who brought his whole self to the task at hand, and who looked at her over a frozen water barrel in the dark like she was the most interesting and important thing in his landscape. She loved him. She had known it since December, probably since November, possibly since the night of the storm, if she was being honest with the version of herself that didn't have reasons to be cautious. She loved him quietly and completely, and with the full weight of a person who had not handed this particular thing to anyone before and who intended, when she finally said it out loud, to mean it exactly and permanently. She said it in February. They were at the fence between properties, a thing that had become something of a symbolic location for them at this point, the place where their worlds met and where the most honest conversations tended to happen. The weather had softened slightly, fall-spring, the kind that tricks the land briefly before March arrives to clarify the situation, and there was thin sunlight on the frozen ground, and Roy had his coat open at the collar for the first time in weeks. She had been talking about the cattle she wanted to buy come April, 2 or 3 head to start, and the particular breed she was considering, and she stopped in the middle of her sentence about grazing rotation because she was looking at him in the thin February sunlight, and she could not continue a conversation about cattle. "I love you," she said. The words went out into the still air and sat there, clean and irretrievable and entirely correct. Roy looked at her, and the expression on his face was everything that had been building since October, everything she'd cataloged and stored and tried not to need, distilled into one clear, direct, transformative moment. "I love you," he said, simply and completely and without qualification. They stood on either side of the fence in the thin winter sun, and she reached over and put her hand in his, and they held on to each other across the property line they'd been working beside for 4 months. And Violet thought about her father filing that homestead claim 30 miles away, and her mother saying that hesitation was fear with better manners, and the stagecoach driver who had offered to burn the legal document, and Mr. Aldous Finch's careful letter arriving at her kitchen table. and all the long chain of accidents and choices and stubbornnesses that had brought her to this frozen fence line with this man's hand in hers. She was grateful for every single link in that chain. March arrived, and with it the clarity it had promised, and Violet's second winter in Wyoming came to what she could only describe as a triumphant close. She had made it through. The eastern section was intact and improved and ready for spring. She had a plan, a real one, with numbers and timelines and the kind of agricultural knowledge that her father would have respected and her mother would have been proud of. She also had Roy, who had kept every implicit promise of the winter simply by continuing to be exactly himself, which was, she had discovered, the most reliable thing about him and the thing she loved most completely. In the last week of March, on a Sunday morning after services, Roy asked her to walk with him to the eastern section. It was the first real spring day, the kind where the light is different, softer and more golden than winter light, and the creek was running free along the northern boundary, and the grass was beginning to come back in thin green lines between the frost brown, and the whole landscape had the quality of something waking up slowly and pleased about it. He took her to the northeast corner of her property, where the creek bent south, and there was a wide, flat piece of ground that she had mentioned in November would be perfect for a proper house someday, a real one with more rooms and a proper porch, and a kitchen large enough for the kind of cooking she planned to do. He stopped there and turned to face her, and he had his hat in his hands, which she recognized, and she felt a warmth she could barely contain spreading from her chest outward. "I told you in December I was going to wait for the spring," he said. His voice was steady and direct and entirely sincere. "I want to ask you to marry me, Violet. I want to build a life here with you on this land that you have made your own, and I want to be your partner in it, in all of it, the practical work and the hard winters and the planning and the future. I don't want to take anything from you or manage anything that's yours. I want to stand beside you while you make it what you're going to make it." He met her eyes. "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life telling you so." Violet looked at him in the spring light, at this man who had revised his assumptions on the first day, and helped her without being asked and knocked on her door in a storm with cornbread and dry humor, and told her she decided and meant it in the deepest possible way. "Yes," she said. He stepped forward and kissed her, and it was different from December, fuller and warmer and carrying the weight of a decision instead of a hope. And when they separated she was laughing, which surprised her, and he was smiling, which was the best version of his face, and the creek was running behind them and the spring light was on everything. "I want to tell you something," she said when the laughter had settled. "I was ready to say yes in December. I was ready in November, honestly." "November," he raised an eyebrow. "The fence supplies," she said. "When you held them out without saying anything, I thought, this man understands exactly what help looks like and doesn't confuse it with pity, and I was absolutely in trouble after that." He laughed then, a real one, full and warm, and she felt it like sunlight. They told Crane that afternoon. The old rancher looked at them both for a long moment, and then he looked at the window, and then he said, "Well, I suppose that changes the property line situation entirely." Violet said, "It changes nothing about the property line situation. The eastern section is mine." Crane turned and looked at her, and something passed across his face that was unmistakably respect. "Yes," he said, "it is." Roy said, "Nothing about Violet's ownership changes." Crane said, "I know that, I was." He stopped. "Congratulations," he said with the gravity of a man offering the word seriously. "To both of you." They were married in June of 1883, in the churchyard in Broken Spur, in the early summer heat, with Mrs. Aldrich presiding over the reception with the authority of a general who has been planning this campaign since October and finds the outcome entirely satisfactory. Hector Crane sat in the front row and looked at the ceremony with the expression of a man who had not expected to be moved and was annoyed with himself for being so. Aldous Finch came from Laramie, because Violet had written to him about the marriage, and he had replied that he would be there if she would have him, because he had spent 11 months hoping the land claim would work out well for her, and was pleased beyond measure that it had worked out better. Violet wore her mother's brooch on the cream-colored dress she'd made herself through the winter evenings when Roy wasn't there, and the cabin needed filling with something productive. Roy wore a clean dark coat and a white shirt, and no hat because Mrs. Aldrich had told him that men left their hats off at weddings, and this was not negotiable. He looked at Violet coming down the aisle with his hands loose at his sides, and his face open in a way she had never seen him wear in public before, entirely without guard, wearing everything he felt directly. She walked toward him and thought about her mother and her father and the homestead east of Cheyenne, and the long chain of losses and stubbornnesses that had led her here, to this dry June morning in Broken Spur, Wyoming, to this man who had told her she decided, and had meant it as a declaration of love long before he knew how to say so. The preacher said the words, and they said theirs, and Roy put his mother's ring on her finger with steady hands and complete attention, and when the preacher said the ceremony was complete and Roy kissed his bride, the assembled townspeople and ranch hands and neighbors of Broken Spur, Wyoming, produced a sound of collective approval that satisfied Mrs. Aldrich and made Hector Crane clear his throat and look away. They spent the first weeks of married life in Violet's cabin, which was still Violet's cabin and was understood to be so, while they planned and then began building the house on the northeast corner, the one she'd pointed to in November and he'd remembered and had specifically chosen for the proposal. Roy had a decision to make about his position at the Double C. They talked about it over several evenings, honestly and without pressure, sitting at the small table in the cabin in the evening light while the summer went on outside. His skills as a foreman were real, and his loyalty to Crane was genuine, and the position provided income that would matter while the eastern section was building towards self-sufficiency. At the same time, the eastern section needed management, real management, and Violet was not willing to ask Roy to give up his work for hers. The solution came from Crane himself, who offered Roy a new arrangement in early July that allowed him to manage both properties in a joint capacity, with the understanding that his primary obligation during planting and building seasons would be to the Shepard section, and that his wages from the Double C would reflect this reduced time. It was a generous arrangement, more generous than anyone had expected from the old rancher, and when Violet thanked him for it, Crane said, "I owe you several kinds of better than I've been, Miss Shepard. This is one of them." She had corrected him gently, Mrs. Norris now, and he had actually smiled briefly and fully and said, "Mrs. Norris then." The house went up through July and August, framed by Roy and two hired hands and Violet herself, who was not inclined to stand aside while her own house was built, and who turned out to have a better eye for level than either of the hired men, and a considerably greater tolerance for height when working on the roof frame. Roy watched her on the roof with the expression he'd worn at the fence that morning in October, the careful, specific attention of a man cataloging something that mattered. When she came down from the roof one afternoon, he caught her at the bottom of the ladder and kissed her in front of the hired hands, who were visibly entertained. "What was that for?" she said. "You had sawdust in your hair," he said. "It seemed like the right response." She looked at him. "That is not a logical response to sawdust in hair." "I'm working on my logic," he said. They moved into the house in early September, 1 year almost exactly from the day Violet had stepped off the stagecoach in Broken Spur. The house was everything she had imagined from the northeast corner in November: proper rooms, a real kitchen, a porch that faced east and caught the morning light, a loft that would one day be something other than storage. On the first evening in the new house, they sat on the east-facing porch in the September dusk and watched the last light on the creek and the fence line and the wide, extraordinary quiet of the Wyoming country, and Roy put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and there was no gap between them at all. "1 year ago today," she said, I stepped off the stage in broken spur with a carpetbag and a legal document and a rifle. 1 year ago today, he said, Crane told me to go show a woman her property line, and I thought it was going to be simple. She looked up at him. Was it? The most complicated thing I've ever done, he said, worth every complication. She kissed him on the porch in the September dusk, and the land spread out before them, hers and his and theirs, every fence post and creek bend and frost-brown acre of it, carrying the history of what it had taken to arrive at this exact point, this porch, this evening, this man, this life. In the spring of 1884, Violet and Roy Norris welcomed their first child into the world in the house on the northeast corner of the eastern section of what would eventually be registered in the Crook County land records as the Norris Shepard Ranch. The baby was a boy, born in April when the creek was running high and the grass was coming back green, and they named him Thomas for her father, with Roy's surname following because that was who they both were now, each carrying the other's story. Hector Crane came to see the baby on the third day, riding out from the main house on a Tuesday morning with a wrapped parcel that turned out to contain a hand-carved wooden horse that he admitted, when pressed, to having made himself over the winter. He held Thomas for 7 minutes, which was the longest Roy had ever seen Crane remain still in one place, and the old rancher's face held an expression during those 7 minutes that was entirely without its usual weathered distance. When he handed the baby back to Violet, he said, "He's going to know this land." "He is," Violet said. "Good," said Crane, and went home. Mrs. Aldrich, who visited the day after Crane, stayed for 3 hours and left a week's worth of meals and declared Thomas to be perfect in every particular, which was exactly what she would have said regardless of what Thomas looked like, but which also happened to be accurate. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not easy, because the frontier was never easy, and Roy and Violet understood this and had stopped expecting it to be, but rich with the particular texture of a life being actively built and inhabited. The eastern section grew. By 1885, they had a working cattle operation with 30 head and 2 hired hands of their own, one a young man from Missouri named William, who reminded Roy of himself at 18, and whom he took on with the quiet kindness of someone paying a debt forward, and one an older woman named Agnes, who had come west from Kansas after the death of her husband, and who could ride and doctor cattle with a competence that Violet admired with full professional sincerity. In 1886, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara for Violet's mother, and Thomas, who was 2 and certain that the world existed primarily for his benefit, adjusted his position on this matter after approximately 1 week of Clara's company and became her fierce and devoted ally for the rest of their childhood. Roy continued his arrangement with the Double C through 1887, when Hector Crane, now nearing 70 and slower in the joints than he would admit, began the process of reducing the ranch's operation in preparation for eventually handing it off. He had no children, a fact he had never discussed with anyone, and that Roy understood was a closed room in the old man's house. But he had, over 5 years of adjacent living and shared fence lines, and the quiet accumulation of genuine respect, come to think of the Norris Shepard household as something close to what he might have had in a different life. And when he began the process of righting his affairs in order, he made a provision that surprised everyone, including Roy. He left the grazing rights to the western section of the Double C to Roy Norris, not in perpetuity, but for his lifetime, with a first right of purchase should the estate decide to sell. It was a practical provision, the kind a man of property makes when he wants a known, trusted steward for what he's leaving, but it was also, everyone who knew Crane understood, as close to a declaration of family as the old man knew how to make. Roy told Violet about it on the porch, the same east-facing porch where they'd sat on the first September evening, and she was quiet for a while, looking at the creek, and then she said, "He never knew how to say things directly either." Roy looked at her. "He just said it," she said, In his language, she reached over and took his hand. We should go thank him properly. They went the next morning, all four of them with Thomas and Clara, and Crane received them in his front room with the particular care of a man who has become aware that certain things are not forever, and who has decided, somewhat late in his assessment, that being entirely undemonstrative about them is not intelligence but loss. He let Clara, who was 4 and fearless, sit on his knee and examine his watch. He listened to Thomas, who was 6 and had opinions about everything, explain a complex theory about horses. He drank coffee at his own table with Roy and Violet, and talked about the land and the coming spring, and what it would mean for the western section, and the eastern section to operate in closer coordination. And he was entirely himself, gruff and spare with words and precise in every practical observation, and also more present than she had ever seen him, as if the provision he'd made had opened something in him that had needed opening for a long time. When they left, he stood at the gate in the cold spring air, and he watched them ride back across the property line toward their house, and Violet turned once and saw him still standing there, a large old man in the early Wyoming spring, watching them go with something in his face that, at this distance, and in this light, looked very much like peace. Hector Crane died in the winter of 1889, quietly and on his own terms, in the house he'd built and the land he'd shaped for 40 years. Roy was with him at the end, sitting in the chair beside his bed in the manner of a son with a father, though neither of them would have used that word out loud. Violet came later that morning, and she sat with Roy in the front room of the empty house, and they held hands in the silence of the place, and she thought about chains again, about the long chains of choices and accidents that connect people to each other across the distances they never meant to travel, and she was grateful, deeply and specifically grateful, for every link. The Double C was eventually purchased by a ranching family from Colorado in 1891, good people who knew the land and honored what Crane had built. Roy's arrangement with the estate concluded cleanly, and the Norris Shepard ranch stood complete and independent on its own terms for the first time, which felt, to both of them, exactly as it should. By 1892, the eastern section that Violet had arrived to claim with a carpetbag, and a legal document had become something her father would have been astonished by and her mother would have pronounced exactly right. 160 acres, fully worked, with cattle and horses and a garden that produced through 3 seasons and 2 hired hands who were more like family than employees. A house with a real kitchen and a porch, and a loft that had been converted to bedrooms for 2 children who were growing at a rate Violet found personally unreasonable. A creek that she knew by heart in every season, high and low and frozen and running. And Roy, who came to breakfast every morning with his hair not yet combed, and his opinion about whatever had needed doing yesterday already formed and delivered, who argued with her about cattle breeds with an enthusiasm that bordered on irrational, who read to their children every evening without being asked, who had learned over 9 years to say directly the things he felt rather than show them in careful, oblique ways, though the showing was still there, and she still loved it most. On a September evening in 1892, almost exactly 10 years from the day Violet had stepped off the stage in Broken Spur, she sat on the east-facing porch and watched the last light go off the creek. Roy came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and the sounds from inside the house were Thomas and Clara conducting some negotiation about something that was probably perfectly ordinary, and to which both of them were bringing a level of intensity that was entirely their parents' fault. 10 years, Violet said. 10 years, Roy agreed. She leaned into his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him, familiar as the land, as the sound of the creek, as the particular quality of September light in Wyoming. She thought about the woman who had stood on the stagecoach step in Broken Spur with her carpetbag and her stubbornness, braced for difficulty, and entirely unaware that the difficulty she was braced for was going to turn out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. She thought about a gruff old rancher standing at a gate and eventually, grudgingly, finding something in himself that was larger than his resentment. She thought about a man in a stable doorway, hat in his hands, turning it slow, saying 2 words into the dirt floor while she held a ledger against her chest and tried to understand what she was feeling. She decides. She had decided everything in the end. She had decided to come. She had decided to stay. She had decided to trust. She had decided to love. She had decided to build something here that would last beyond her, something with roots deep enough to hold through the Wyoming winters, something that her children and their children would stand on and look out at and understand had been made by hand and will and the particular courage of people who had looked at a hard thing and decided it was worth doing. "Are you happy?" Roy asked, which was not a question he asked often, and which carried the full weight of a man who would do anything in his power to ensure the answer. Violet looked at the creek and the land and the September sky, enormous and clear, and felt the warmth of him beside her and the sounds of her children inside the house, and the specific, unperformable reality of a life that was exactly what she'd made it. "Completely," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair, and she closed her eyes, and the creek ran along the northern boundary in the fading light, and everything was exactly right. Inside the house, Thomas and Clara reached a resolution to their negotiation that satisfied neither of them, which was the best possible outcome, and the evening went on in the quiet, full, perfectly ordinary way of evenings that are simply the texture of a life well lived, one unremarkable moment after another, each one carrying, underneath its ordinary surface, the whole extraordinary story of how it had come to be. And on the east-facing porch of the Norris Shepard Ranch in Crook County, Wyoming, in September of 1892, with a coffee cup warm in her hands and a good man's shoulder under her head, and the creek running free along the boundary of 160 acres that were hers and had always been hers, Violet Shepard Norris sat and watched the last light leave the land and felt, completely and without reservation, that she had decided exactly right.